harder to operate an LLC versus a corporation? You may have seen that title, you may have been intrigued by it, and it is absolutely true in some cases. And we're going to dive into that today. So we're going to peel back that layer. We're going to talk about why it can be harder to operate as an LLC than a corporation. As always, this is not legal advice. Consult your own legal counsel. We're here just to educate you, give you ideas, give you things to talk about as you get through the business process and meet with your lawyer. Yeah, the big thing is LLCs are supposed to be easy, right? That's what we all hear, is that, form an LLC, it's simple. It's certainly simple to get that state stamp back on an LLC. Did a couple videos here on the channel before, which you can check out about how to form an LLC, how to form a corporation. If you look through those videos, it's pretty simple, right? And the LLC, you can see, at least in Delaware, certificate of formation has a lot less information than the articles of incorporation would. You'll see the same thing probably in most other states. The LLC, you're just checking a couple of boxes and filing with the state, and you've got a stamp, and you could potentially get a bank account. So, it seems really, really easy to get an LLC started, and it is from that. But if you had a takeaway from that last video or recent video on how to form an LLC, I hope one of the things you took away from it was that LLCs need a really good operating agreement, because that operating agreement becomes key. And that's really where the complication can come in, right? LLCs are supposed to be easy, freedom of contract, do what you want to do, but you need a good contract, right? It needs to write down how things work. It needs to explain things. It needs to have mechanisms to deal with various eventualities in business, right? You can't just leave things open-ended. Freedom of contract rules in the LLC context. You have some default rules probably in the statute. Whatever state you form in, that LLC Act is likely the one that's governing how your business is run. But you can often modify. A lot of times, it allows you to modify by contract whatever the state standards are. So you can start changing everything within your LLC documents. And that's part of where the danger point comes in, right? That LLC operating agreement is the key. And if you don't have it tuned in right, you can create a lot of difficulty. You can create vagueness. You can create situations that are unaccounted for. And then if we take that a step further, if you have a multi-owner situation, a lot of times then you'll have amendment provisions that require perhaps unanimous consent to amend, maybe require a supermajority to amend. Maybe require a third party to amend, right? If you took out a bank loan, the bank may say you can't amend this agreement without the consent of the bank. You can suddenly find yourself in a situation, if your operating agreement is not optimal and not really built up for all the eventualities, that you're having a hard time getting the approvals or the votes needed to carry an action, right? Let's say you need to wind down your company. There are set procedures generally for that in the corporation code, vote of the board of directors, maybe shareholder involvement, right? Whatever the process is under the applicable corporate law, you can start the process of winding your company down. You go into that corporate law and it's going to explain the process to you. LLCs, your LLC statute, you're going to have to go back to it. A lot of times it's going to defer back to the consent needed in the agreement. Is that consent possible? Did you wire it in such a way that it's hard to it, right? Are you caught in a place where you can't get the necessary consent to take an action, but your business is locked from doing other things? I've seen many times LLCs have put themselves in that position, which is why, again, it's so important at the beginning that you get a good LLC operating agreement that's tailored to you, right? Not just some form off the internet, not some generic thing, but an LLC agreement that really sets forth how your company's going to run, the votes needed, and also anticipates, as much as realistically possible, what various votes are going to need and what consents are going to be for likely situations that are going to come up in your company, right? Because what you don't want to do is have a situation where the company cannot get an approval to continue to proceed. You get locked into a situation, where you maybe have a unanimous consent requirement. The company can't do a major transaction without a unanimous consent. And you have one member, maybe a minority member, 10% owner, says no. Now you're locked. And if there's not another way around it in your agreement, guess what? You've made your LLC life very, very complicated and difficult. And you may not have some of the options at that point that you would under a corporate code, right? Because, one thing that sits there in the background in a corporate code, you can potentially merge a company. You can potentially do a reverse stock split. There's strategies that are embedded in these corporate codes that lawyers have worked out over many, many years, where you can work through some of these deadlock situations or some things. You might have some options under corporate law that you wouldn't have under LLC law in a particular set of circumstances. Again, because the corporate law is largely built by statute. It's a framework, and you plug your company into that framework, and you can adjust the framework some. The LLC situation generally defers to your contract. Yes, there's a framework, but it's not as strong of a framework generally in an LLC act versus a corporation, which is why we can end up in these weird situations where this happens, right? That no rigid framework in the LLC context could be the downfall of why it's so much harder to get things done in an LLC versus a corporation, because sometimes you hit a situation you didn't think about, and the way out is to go back to that rigid framework of the corporation and use some strategy, a merger into another company, a reverse stock split. Not that these types of corporate transactions that I'm just throwing out are simple or easy and don't have their own litigation risk, but they at least have a path forward that you may not have in the LLC side, right? That lack of the framework causes the issue, right? Now you're on your own to figure things out if you didn't get boiled into your LLC agreement. This is one of the reasons why you want to think about that amendment provision in your LLC agreement early on. The general concept is majority of units, majority of LLC interests will allow the amendment of an LLC agreement. That is good because if you end up in a terrible deadlock, you can amend the LLC agreement and then use the amended LLC agreement to move out of the deadlock. But if you start putting some supermajority provisions in, everybody must agree, unanimous consent type provisions, they are certainly protective of the smaller owners, and the smaller owners will be wild about having that protection, making sure that they still have a voice, they still have a vote, they can still block transactions, they still get a seat at the negotiating table. That's why you usually put a unanimous consent provision in an agreement. But putting that provision in an agreement means that if that person walks away from the table, if they're not present, maybe they're unavailable, caught up on other business matters, that you don't have a path forward. And then now you're in a really difficult situation. And we've seen companies do that. We've seen companies have to kind of basically walk away from their business because there's not a path forward. And that's how an LLC can be a lot more complicated. And special situations can arise in the LLC life, right? We don't know what's going to happen in the future. Maybe we get an unexpected, unsolicited offer. Maybe somebody wants to take our LLC private, right? They want to buy it out and take it. There's a lot of things that happen. Maybe you end up in a situation where you do have to vote for a dissolution. I've seen LLCs that haven't had the proper dissolution provision in their agreement, right? All of these things could happen. And if we don't have the agreements in place to protect us, we can end up in a bad spot. All of this to say LLCs are still good. I do not want you running away from LLCs because of what we're talking about today. It's not to say you should not use an LLC, certainly not to say for everybody that a corporation are better. I would still recommend an LLC for most people who don't want to get into all the structure and formatting of a corporation. But what we do want to emphasize is that even though you have a corporation, even though you have an LLC, doesn't mean that you've thought about everything and you can't run the situations. So you got to balance the two. LLCs are still great, but now you understand one of the major risks, and hopefully you can do some planning to keep yourself away from it. So be careful, plan for the unexpected things, get some experienced counsel to help you understand what might likely happen in the life of your LLC, and make sure you get that LLC agreement tuned in for that so you don't end up in a situation where unexpected things happen. What do you think? Would love to hear your comments. Are you now scared of LLCs? Do you still think LLCs are better than corporations? How would you balance an LLC versus a corporation? Love to hear that in the comments and your thoughts. Again, not legal advice, consult your counsel, but thanks for being here today. Don't be afraid of the LLC. Just make sure you get it done right. They are oversold as being a lot simpler than they are. They are wonderful tools. They are well created. They make a lot of sense for a lot of businesses, but there's still work to be done. Just because you're an LLC doesn't mean you can shove all the work to the side and ignore a lot of those business law issues. They're still there. They're just there in a different way, and it's your responsibility as a business owner to get them done right. All right, folks. Our Shawn McBride. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you subscribe to the channel. Hope to see you again soon.